Will you join me in a word of prayer this morning? Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Each week I get together with a few of the pastors from our sister Lutheran Church Missouri Synod congregations here in the Spokane area and one by phone from the Odessa area. And we have Bible study together in the morning, looking at the text for worship for the weeks to come, sharing ideas with one another, and not just Bible study, which it is, but it's also looking ahead to how are we going to present this to you, and sharing ideas with each other on how to do that. And then once a month, I get together with other pastors, also of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod congregations across North Idaho, and they get together with us as well. And we all get together, it might be 15 or 20 pastors there, and we do the same thing. But then we have some continuing education. We also worship together. Whenever we worship, we invite one of the pastors to preach. And this last month, it was Pastor Ryan Tanetti from Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church on the South Hill, Spokane. And as he shared God's words with us, his church is following a different set of readings than what we are at Holy Cross. They're following an older set of readings that actually celebrates Transfiguration Sunday in the same text we're using now several weeks ago. So as he preached for us, he invited us, the other pastors who were gathered, to beg and borrow anything we wanted from his message because he was knowing that we were going to have to preach on this in just a couple weeks. And so I took him up on that. Contacted him and said, were you serious? I'd love to. Because ever since I heard that message from him about this Transfiguration story, it's been rattling around in my heart and mind, and it's been affecting my life. And if I can share that blessing with you, the same blessing it's been for me, I'd love to do that. Of course, he gave me permission to do so. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. The best that I can recall, share that message with you. Just pass along from one disciple to another. Which I think is fitting for us this morning, because that's what really happened with Transfiguration. We're reading the account for today from Matthew chapter 17. And he's telling us what happened, but Matthew wasn't there. There were only 3 disciples who went up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. And so whatever Matthew's sharing with us today is a word of God about the Transfiguration that was then passed on to him from the disciples who were there, who then Matthew is passing on to other disciples. So it's fitting for us to continue doing that today. We do have the first-hand testimony, though, of one of the disciples who was there. That was part of our reading. That was from 2 Peter. As Peter talks about it, he says, we ourselves were eyewitnesses of his majesty, for we were with him on that holy mountain. But Peter also is not above just sharing what he's learned and the insights with others in the body of Christ from other church leaders who shared it too. Later on in that same epistle, 2 Peter, he says in chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, well, this is just like our beloved brother Paul also spoke to you in all of his letters when he writes about these things. And so the message that God has given us is a message that's to be shared. And so whether it's from Pastor Janetti to me, to you, or also from you to others, I invite you to share as well. And so with that intro, it's time for us to begin getting into the text. But before we get into that story that I was sharing the children's message about in Matthew chapter 17, the story of the Transfiguration, how 3 disciples went up on the mountain with Jesus, and when they got there, his face was transformed like the sun, his clothes shined as bright as light, and then there was on either side of him Moses and Elijah. We have to step back into the Old Testament and go back to the call of Moses so we can understand a little bit about what's going on that mountaintop. So if we go back into Exodus chapter 3, we find Moses, who has been for a lot of years, simply at this point in his life, a shepherd. He's been that ever since he ran away from Pharaoh's household and left for the land of Midian. He grew up in Pharaoh's household, but then when he left for the land of Midian, he didn't look back. He was afraid to go back. And so he met his wife there in the land of Midian, and he began his life as a shepherd, taking care of his father-in-law's flocks. And he had been doing that by this point in Exodus chapter 3 for some 40 years. That's a long career by anyone's stretch. And that's what he had been doing, and presumably tending those flocks in the same area. In Exodus chapter 3, he happens to be on the shoulder of a place called Mount Sinai. And he's taking care of flocks, passing over paths, walking past scenery that he's seen who knows how many times. He knows everything. He knows every rock. He knows Except there was something different that day that he noticed. Something he'd never seen before. There was a bush on fire. And he turned his attention to it. Now, maybe initially his attention is turned to it because he's concerned about the safety of his father-in-law's flocks and if that blaze should spread. But then as he looked closer, he realized that there were flames, but the bush wasn't really on fire. That is, it wasn't being consumed. It wasn't burning. And that caused him to turn aside, the text says, and go nearer. And when he did, he heard the angel of the Lord, or maybe the Lord himself, speak out of that bush. Moses! Moses! Here I am. I mean, what do you say to a bush that's talking to you, right? Here I am. That's all the text says. Moses said, here I am. And then God spoke again. He said, don't come any closer. The ground in which you are standing is holy ground. Go and take off your sandals. This is holy ground. Now, I don't know about you, I'm kind of imagining what Moses might have been thinking when he said, oh, here I am, and then after he hears this. I'm imagining Moses is thinking, holy ground? Really? This place? This place that I've walked, I don't know how many times, this place that has my footprints in it, this place with so much scrub brush and rock that my animals don't even want to eat it, this place where my sheep follow me, where they graze, this place where my sheep, they do their sheep stuff. This is holy ground? Well, yeah, Moses. This is holy ground. It's made holy. This common, this ordinary space has been made holy by the presence of God. And not only has this ground been transformed into a holy place, but God's intending to do that with your life. This life that you've been using just to tend sheep, God's now about to make a holy life by separating it by his calling. And so that every moment from here on out is lived for him. And to start with, you're going to do the thing that you dread more than anything else. I'm going to send you back to Egypt to talk to Pharaoh, to face that fear. Because you're going to bring my people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And then when you do, Moses, here's the sign. You're going to come back here to this mountain. You're going to worship me before this mountain. And just like I spoke to you, I'm going to speak to those people too. And not because this mountain is anything holy in itself, these rocks or the way they're set up or these bushes, but because of my transforming presence here. Because the children of Israel weren't always going to stay at that mountain. They did go back to that mountain. And that was our Old Testament lesson that Mark read for today. From the book of Exodus, it talks about how Moses and the leaders of Israel came back to that mountain. And they went up, and they too, Moses, Nadab, Abihu, 70 elders of Israel, they sat before God. They beheld him. They ate and drank. They were there on that mountain, in that holy ground. But that holy ground wasn't just the mountain, because these people were going to be sent to the promised land, and they were going to have to travel through the wilderness. And God said, so that you know my presence goes with you everywhere you go. It's not just on this mountain. I want you to make a tent for me, a tabernacle. It's just a very elaborate tent. He said, wherever you go in the wilderness, when you set up that tabernacle, I promise I will come and dwell in that space. And so every bit of dirt, rocks, brush, whatever it was that was enclosed in that tabernacle, wherever they put it, became holy ground because God kept his promise to descend and to dwell there. Now we're ready to go up with Peter, James, and John onto that mountain of transfiguration in Matthew chapter 7. And Jesus is leading us. And just like I was kind of imagining what Moses might have been thinking in the time of his call, I'm kind of imagining what Peter, James, and John are thinking, or maybe what you and I would think if we were walking with them up that mountain. I'd be thinking, Jesus, I'm getting kind of tired, kind of hungry. Can we stop somewhere along here? And by the way, how far do we need to go anyway? This is a pretty high mountain. And do we really have to be at the top of the mountain for whatever you're going to show us? Because can't we do it further down here? And if we do have to be at the top, why'd you have to pick such a high one? Couldn't we go to another one? I mean, it doesn't say in the text what mountain they went to, but it does tell us in verse 1 that Jesus led them up a high mountain. And in the previous chapter 16, it told us that the disciples of Jesus were in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is far to the north of Israel. It's far north of the Sea of Galilee. It's on the southern edge of a mountain range that forms the separation of the border between Lebanon and Syria. And it's the northern edge of what's today the modern state of Israel. It's the Golan Heights region. On the southern edge of that mountain range is where Caesarea Philippi and its remains are. And right next to that is Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon has a ski resort today. It's the only ski resort in the modern state of Israel. And it's up on top of Mount Hermon. And you know what? It's higher than our mountain and our ski resort here in Spokane. It's higher than Mount Spokane. It tops 7,000 feet. And I don't think there was a ski resort there when Jesus took his disciples out. But I only bring that up to say that if that is the mountain that's being talked about in Matthew chapter 17, it was quite a hike to get to the top of it. And when you get to the top of a high mountain like that, what do? The first thing? Don't you look around? Don't you look at the view? Aren't you just enamored by the majesty of the view all around you? Except when the disciples got to the top of this mountain, that's not what their attention was drawn by. And maybe they started off looking at the view, but out of the corner of their eye, they saw something else, and it diverted all their attention. Because as soon as they got to the top, Jesus himself was transfigured before them. And his face shone as bright as the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And now we often chide Peter because we see him as the disciple who always puts his proverbial foot in his mouth by saying things when he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And he does that a lot in the Gospels. And actually, Luke says something about that here when Luke records this story, because Luke said the only reason that Peter said what he's about to say is because Peter didn't know what to say. But Matthew is a little more sympathetic to Peter. And perhaps that's because Luke, who wasn't there either, is coming from a Greek perspective, where he was Greek, and Matthew, on the other hand, was Hebrew, and so he maybe knew a little bit more of this background. But Matthew at least sympathizes that Peter, in some sense, gets it. In some sense, some facet, understands what's going on here, because the next thing Peter says is, "It's good, Lord, for us to be here. And if you wish, I'll put up 3 tabernacles. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Yeah, in your text it says tent in chapter 17, but it's the same word for the tabernacle, the tent that they built in the days of Moses for God's presence to travel in the wilderness. And so Peter understands that what's happening with here right now with us on the mountain is the same thing that happened to Moses. The very presence of God is here, and he's transforming this place into holy ground. So we need to build a tabernacle, or 3 tabernacles. But actually, if there's a mistake that Peter makes, it's this, and it's a pretty big one. The mistake Peter makes is thinking of Jesus as just one of 3. See, we'll make 3 tabernacles, one for each of you, as if Jesus is on par with Moses and Elijah who show up there. And that's when God corrects him. God speaks, not out of the bush, but out of the cloud. And he says, "This," meaning Jesus, "is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And then when Jesus reached down to lift up his disciples because they had fallen down, face down to the ground after hearing the voice of God in terror, he lifted them up, and when they lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. God had indeed brought his holy presence into that place and transformed that place into holy ground. Not in the presence of a bush that burned without being consumed, but in the presence of Jesus, whose face was burning without being consumed. The transforming presence of God would go with Jesus wherever he was going. That was a truth the disciples needed to know. At this point in the gospel, they needed to realize that truth, because Jesus was about to lead them to another mountain, and under much more threatening circumstances. This time, Jesus' face would look very different too. Only not because it would be shining like the sun, but because it would be covered in his own blood. Jesus' clothes would look very different too. And not because they were going to be shining bright as light, but instead because they were going to be ripped from him and bartered to other people. And there were going to be 2 people appearing on either side, but they wouldn't be prophets. They would be criminals, one crucified on this side, the other one on that side, as Jesus hung there. And the disciples needed to realize that even on that mountain where Jesus was crucified, that his transforming presence could change even that instrument of death into a means for bringing life. Because where the presence of God is, it's always a transforming presence that turns the ordinary, the worthless, even the disgusting and disturbing ground into holy ground. Pastor Tonetti also pointed us to an article that was written by Reverend Dr. Daniel Gard. Reverend Daniel Gard is now the current president of Concordia University in Chicago, one of the universities of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod out of our university system. But before that, he had been a retired U.S. Naval Admiral. And when he was in the Navy, he spent his whole career as a chaplain in chaplaincy ministry. And so several years ago, he had written an article for the seminary of our church body in Fort Wayne, Indiana, an article about chaplain ministry and about how important a mission field it was to bring the gospel to our soldiers wherever they were around the world, and encouraging people who were thinking about going into ministry to consider military chaplaincy. And in that article, he talked about his time serving as a chaplain in the U.S. Navy, and particularly one field exercise training that he was a part of in North Carolina that spanned the weekend of Easter. And it was a field training exercise in which, like many other, all the men were out in the field. They were living in wartime conditions. That meant whatever kind of weather was going on, they were out in the field for the whole thing. And they had their objectives they had to complete. In particular, his unit was supposed to complete some construction projects. In the meantime, they were supposed to be defending their area from an aggressor force, which was another Marine unit that was coming after them. And so while all this was going on, Easter came. And so they all took a break from all the mock war games for just 3 hours on Easter morning. And Reverend Gard led an Easter sunrise service out there in the field. But they didn't have the pleasantries of the chapel or anything like that because they are out in the field. So they had set up a tent in order to worship in. It was just covered. It was going to be just a dirt floor. And that's where they were going to have this Easter worship. But it rained torrential rains the night before. And those rains ran rivers through what was supposed to be their worship tent. And what was supposed to be a dirt floor turned into a spongy, sloppy, mucky mess for that morning. And yet for that morning, when the half-light of the dawn came, Reverend Gard proclaimed the news of the resurrection and of Jesus' victory over sin and over death. And then after dawn, when it was time in that service to invite people to come up to receive the Lord's Supper, he said he was surprised. The soldiers there came up one by one, and not only did they come up one by one, but he was surprised as they came up one by one that they knelt down in the mud to receive the Lord's Supper. And he said after the service was over, a chief petty officer came over to him and said, "Thank you, because you don't really understand the Eucharist until you've had it kneeling in the mud." And Reverend Gard said that was probably the most profound statement about the heart of theologies he'd ever heard from anybody, any pastor or clergy or anybody since, coming from this sailor. That's because that's what the Lord is doing in the Lord's Supper. Whenever we share that together, he's coming in the ordinariness of bread and wine, and he's coming to us in our muck and in our mire, our sinfulness and the habits that we've been wallowing in, and he's coming to us, and Jesus is inviting us to see that in there is his transforming presence. That all the benefits of his crucifixion and resurrection are right there for us, and his forgiveness washes away our sin, and there's a holy calling for us, just like there was for Moses on that holy ground. And that holy calling for us is a calling that from that time forward, we live every moment for him. God takes the muck and the mire and he transforms that space into holy ground. He does it when we celebrate the Eucharist together. He does it when we hear his word together. He does it in baptism. He does it in our lives every day. Pastor Tonetti shared one more story. He shared the story about his vicarage year. Vicarage is a time of internship that seminary students do, and it's a part of their education. And I did my year of vicarage here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church, working under Pastor Benning. He did his in Arizona. And when he was in Arizona, his particular task during that year was to help with the church plant they were starting, the church that he was participating in down there. And he said it wasn't really intense mission work. because the mission plant was in a retirement community where all sorts of retirees from the cold of the northern states were moving down to the warmth of the desert Southwest. And the community was growing and growing and growing. And the church had already found somebody in that community who was willing to host worship services in their house, in their living room. And so he was just there participating with them, loving those people, sharing with them God's word, having worship with them. And he said the biggest challenge during that year in that ministry was trying to figure out how to deal with the growth. Because more and more people were moving into that retirement community, more and more people were hearing about this little church, and soon they outgrew this woman's living room, and they outgrew her porch and her backyard, and they had to find somewhere in order to go and worship. And in a retirement community like that that's just growing and growing, there's not much available. There's not much open real estate, and what is there is very expensive. And so they were kind of watching in the community to see if anything would come open for rent that they could rent, and somebody got a lead on a place in a strip mall. That might be a possibility. The only problem with it was right next to one of the local taverns. In fact, it shared a wall with this bar. So the church leaders thought, well, that's really all there is. It's kind of in the price range. Let's go check it out. And the real estate agent who was in charge of that showed them the property, and they looked at it. And after it was over, him and the other church leaders are standing outside, and they're thinking about this and discussing the pros and cons. And while they were doing that, a man came out of the bar and saw them standing there talking about this property and asked them who they were and what they were doing. And they said, oh, we're from such and such a church, and we're thinking about renting the space and putting church services here. And the guy said, well, you can't do that. And they said, well, why not? He said, because I don't want to come out of the bar and see a church here. Pastor Snay said it was at that moment they decided we had to put the church there. And no matter how loud that music was going to come from the bar on the other side of the wall, they were going to fight back with their good Lutheran hymns. You know, when it comes to God's transforming presence in our lives, our problem isn't getting God to come in and transform our lives into His holy ground. Our God is good at doing that. Oftentimes our problem is that we're sometimes like that guy that came out of the bar. We're sometimes not ready to let Him transform us in that way. Or there's parts of our lives, there's some secret wants in there that we really don't want Him to find. There's areas of our life that we don't want Him to step into. There's corners of our life that are lived loud with unforgiveness for somebody else. And there's storefronts in our lives that are occupied by unholy things. And there are just rivers flooding us with materialism and self-centeredness and envy that make the ground spongy, mucky, muddy mess in our life. And we kind of like it that way. We're comfortable with it. And we're afraid to see that change. See, the Lord was calling Moses in that holy ground to face that fear and go with Him. And it's always safer on holy ground. And God comes to us and calls us the same way. He comes to us in His transforming presence through His Word, through bread and wine, and His body and blood, through the waters of baptism. He calls us to face those fears. But He goes with us. And it's always safer on holy ground. In Jesus' name.